Hello students! In this video I'm going to talk about modernism, which is the literary movement we're going to be spending time with over the next few weeks of the summer term. What you need to know is that we're leaving behind the 1800s and moving into the 1900s. We're in the 20th century now, and modernism takes place roughly between 1900 and 1945, give or take. Historians might debate and say that it doesn't start until 1905 and it continues until 1950 or so. So we can fudge it 5, 10 years either way on either side of those years. But generally, the first half of the 20th century are the dates for modernism. So I know this isn't a history class, but in order to understand what's happening with the literature, it's going to be really, really helpful to look at what's happening. Pausing. Wait a second here. Yeah. Hello, students. This week we're moving into the 20th century, and we're going to be talking about modernism. Actually, we're going to spend 2-3 weeks on modernism. So this video is going to give you the basics, the very basics of a pretty complex artistic and literary movement. The first thing to know is that we are moving into the 20th century, as I mentioned. The dates for modernism are 1900 to 1945, give or take a few years on either side. Historians might debate when exactly the modern movement starts, but let's just say for our purposes that the approximate dates are 1900 to 1945. Although this isn't a history class, I'd like you to just kind of think about what's going on in America and in the world during these decades. First of all, Queen Victoria dies in 1901. Now, I know this isn't a British literature class, but Queen Victoria's death is actually quite symbolic worldwide. Victorianism was known for its adherence to rules and a sense of propriety, really rigid ideas of right and wrong. Whether that's fair or not is another question. So her death in 1901 is symbolic. And then look at all of these things that are happening during this time period. An enormous amount of upheaval in our country and worldwide is going on. We have 2 world wars, we have the Great Depression, we have Prohibition, and along with Prohibition, the rise of organized crime. We have the Great Migration, in which thousands and thousands of African American families were leaving the South, and the segregation and Jim Crow laws of the South for what they saw as a better life in northern cities. Just tremendous amount of change, historically speaking. On a smaller scale, as I mentioned, in this country we have Jim Crow and segregation. We have tremendous questions about the role of African Americans in our society, a great deal of racism and white supremacy, and that will become more relevant in a couple of weeks when we look at the Harlem Renaissance. We have massive waves of immigration from European countries, from Russia, from other places, and just like today, there are heated debates about the value of immigrants and the changes that they bring with them, the cultures that they bring with them. These changes are exciting, they're enriching, and also they bring with them a lot of questions, for opponents at least. Women's rights and suffrage. Women are increasingly during the wars taking a more public role. We started to talk about that in realism. Women actually finally get the right to vote in 1920 with the passing of the 19th Amendment. So this is a time when the feminist movement is continuing to do more and more public work. The rise of psychology and Freud and psychoanalysis, this idea that we have a divided self is a radical one. The idea of these levels of consciousness and we might not even know ourselves is a jarring one for Americans. We have major changes in technology, most importantly for what we're reading this week, the development of the automobile, and the way that changes our ability to move around the country. We also have the development of consumer culture and popular culture. The radio, the phonograph, motion pictures, advertising, and so on creates a whole level of common culture for our country that we had started to see before, but we see it to a much greater extent during this time. That brings us to modernism. One of the most important things to know about modernism is that modernist writers, modernist artists of all kinds, were generally rejecting the past. They were reacting against the norms of the 19th century. For example, they saw realism and didacticism, in other words, the idea that literature should teach a lesson, as sort of naive. So they rejected that idea. They rejected tradition and authority in general, religious authority, political authority, all kinds of traditions. They rejected as empty, meaningless. Um, and so some modernists were searching for an idiosyncratic or personal vision or myth to replace what they saw as no longer meaningful. They also reacted then against conventional or traditional art forms. So perhaps the biggest thing I want you to remember about modern literature is the idea of experimentation. They experimented with the form, the structure, the style of their writing, and they also experimented with the content of their writing, with what they wrote about. They experimented with how they wrote and what they wrote about. So keep that in mind. Here's a definition I like from the scholar Catherine Lavender. You might remember I recommended a website of hers for context about Gilman's story, The Yellow Wallpaper. This is the same scholar, Catherine Lavender. She points out that modernism is a cultural movement which rebelled against Victorian mores. Victorians believed in a single way of looking at the world, in absolute clear-cut dichotomies between right and wrong, good and bad, but modernists rebelled against those ideals and argued for multiple ways of looking at the world. A modern writer, Gertrude Stein, you've probably heard that name, said this: realism was the last thing the 19th century did completely. Anybody can understand that there is no point in being realistic about here and now. There is no realism now. Life is not real, it is not earnest. It is strange, which is an entirely different matter. Note that punctuation in that last sentence, by the way. That is her punctuation. There's a modernist breaking the standard rules. So this idea that life is not real, it is strange, is an idea that a lot of modernists are working with as they try to capture how they see the world in their writing. So let's look at some themes of modern literature. Let's look at some things that a lot of modern writers wrote about. Again, these are not universals, and some of these themes we'll have seen before and we'll continue to see after the modern period, but in general, these are some themes that we tend to see a lot of in the writing of this period. As I've already mentioned, we see a lot of questioning of authority during this period. We see taboo subject matter, subjects that would not have been written about, or maybe not published if they had been written about. We see making their way into published literature. So, for example, in The Great Gatsby, I don't think I'm spoiling too much if I mention that there is a theme of adultery, something that would have been frowned upon, that wouldn't have been written about in, well, as often or as obviously perhaps in a lot of the writing before this period, is explored more abruptly. Despair. Think about those, the historical context again. The two world wars, the Great Depression. This is a time when the world seems to be falling apart. There's great change. There's great destruction, loss of life, and with that, of course, comes despair. And related to that, loss of meaning in a changed world. The idea that this new world is kind of unknowable. You might recognize this from times of upheaval in your own life, trying to make sense of the world around you. Along with that comes the theme of alienation, the idea that we are alienated from society, that we are lonely in an unknowable world. Another theme is fragmentation, the idea that society is fragmented, that there's no unity anymore, that the world is in pieces. So the idea that the self is fragmented. Remember, Freud says we have these different levels of consciousness and we don't always know our own selves, and so we see that theme in modern literature. We also see the theme of the wasteland, the world in decay. Think about the ash heaps when you're reading The Great Gatsby and how that fits this theme of the world in decay. Again, think of the destruction of the Great Wars. There's also the possibility of the artist as a hero, the artist himself or herself, the idea that it is the artist who is able to pick up the pieces and make things whole again. I want you to think about this theme when we're reading The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot next week. Those are just some of the themes, by the way. We'll talk about others. Others will come up in our discussions and in the reading guides. Let's go over a few of the techniques, the formal experimentation that we see in modern literature. Ezra Pound is associated with the phrase, make it new. This is his challenge to other writers to use their writing, their poetry in particular, to change the way that we see something. We'll talk about that with the Imagists next week. So a lot of experimentation in the writing is a way to get us to see something in a new and different way. So in poetry, for example, we have free verse, poetry that lacks a pattern of rhyme and meter. We also see stream of consciousness. The philosopher William James, Henry James's brother, talked about stream of consciousness. So we see writers trying to replicate that. I'll be eager to hear from you in the discussions where you see that in our writing that's assigned this week. Another thing we see is a lot of ambiguity, things that are left unanswered, particularly unresolved endings. So, for example, at the end of A New England Nun, we know for sure that Louisa has decided not to get married and she's going to live this nice, peaceful, solitary life that she really enjoys. That's pretty clear. But you started to see with writers later in the 1890s, for example, writers like Chopin, who aren't giving us a clear-cut ending. Does Desiree commit suicide in Desiree's Baby? We're not really certain of that, although it seems to suggest so. So we start to see more and more of this in the 20th century. We also start to see alinear plots. Everything we've read until now pretty much follows a linear plot, right? That begins at the beginning, we follow things in chronological order, and we have a nice, clear ending. In modern literature, that chronology becomes, well, it's experimented with. So we get flashbacks, for example, in The Great Gatsby. There's a chapter where Nick says, he's telling us about Gatsby's backstory, and then he says, I didn't learn this at this point yet. I learned this very much later, but I'm telling it to you now. So experimenting with the timeline of a story. Also, fragments in that writing. In this way, it's mirroring the theme of fragmentation, too. Some things are left out. Again, there are jumps in chronology. So think about all of those things for this week's reading. As you know, you're reading two short stories by Ernest Hemingway, Hills Like White Elephants and A Clean, Well-Lighted Place. You'll find a reading guide for those stories under Content. And The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. I'm assuming that many of you have read at least one or two of these texts in high school. I hope so, at least. If not, that's totally fine. You're not at a disadvantage. But I do want to emphasize that if you have read them before, I do expect that you'll be reading them again. They're always better the second time around, particularly The Great Gatsby. Read them again with these ideas about modernism in mind. Don't forget to read all of the discussion posts. That's where a lot of the teaching happens. The teaching and learning in this class happens via discussion. And then I also recommend for some more background on modernism that you take a look at pages 663 through 666 in our textbook. That's all I have for now. So if you have any questions, make sure you let me know on D2L, and I'll see you there.